One year after the confrontation that changed everything, Pete's Diner was preparing for a special celebration. The morning sun cast a golden glow through windows that had been decorated with American flags and military service banners. Today was Harold's 94th birthday, but it was also something more. It was the first annual Veterans Honor Ride organized by the Veterans' Sons. Harold sat in his usual booth, but today he wasn't alone. The diner was packed with people from all over the state, veterans wearing their old uniforms, families carrying photos of their military loved ones, and dozens of motorcycle riders who had heard about the transformation of the former Black Vipers. "Mr. Thompson," Max said, standing tall in his new Veterans Sans leather jacket, which now bore patches honoring military service instead of threatening symbols. "Would you do us the honor of leading today's ride?" Harold looked surprised. "Son, I haven't been on a motorcycle since the war." Max smiled and wheeled in something that made Harold's eyes light up. A restored 1945 military motorcycle with a comfortable sidecar, painted in army green with Harold's old unit number carefully stenciled on the side. "We found it in an old barn," Max explained. "Took us 6 months to restore it. It's exactly like the one you rode in the Pacific." He paused, emotion catching in his voice. "And look who's painted on the side." There, beautifully painted on the sidecar, was a portrait of Martha in her wedding dress, along with the words, "In memory of those who waited." Harold's hand trembled as he touched the painting. Sally brought over Harold's blue coffee mug, now displayed in a special case Pete had built. "We're retiring this mug today," she announced. "It's going right up there on the Wall of Honor." The Wall of Honor was a new addition to the diner, featuring photographs and memories of local veterans. At its center was the photograph of young Harold with his platoon, surrounded by newer photos of the veterans' sons helping at the veterans' home. As Harold prepared for the ride, more than 200 motorcycles lined the street outside Pete's Diner. Each bike carried an American flag, and many had veterans or their family members as passengers. The veterans' sons had arranged for elderly veterans from the home to ride in specially equipped sidecars, just like Harold's. "Before we start," Harold said, standing with the help of his cane, the same one the bikers had once mocked, now polished and proud, "I want to tell you all something." The crowd fell silent, riders and spectators alike leaning in to hear his words. "A year ago, I was just an old man drinking coffee, living in my memories," Harold began. "Then these boys," he gestured to the veterans' sons, "taught me something important. They showed me that it's never too late to make a difference. Never too late to help someone find their way." Max stepped forward, tears in his eyes. "And he taught us that real strength isn't about being tough. It's about being brave enough to care, to help others, to admit when you're wrong and try to make it right." The local high school band, positioned in front of the diner, began playing military service songs. Children waved flags, and families of deployed service members held up photos of their loved ones. Harold settled into the sidecar, looking every bit the proud sergeant he'd been all those years ago. Max, now understanding the weight of legacy he carried, carefully mounted the motorcycle. "Ready, sir?" Max asked. Harold smiled, touching the painting of Martha. "You know, son, I think this is what she would have wanted. Seeing all of us coming together like this, turning something bad into something good." As the procession began, with Harold and Max leading the way, Pete stepped out of his diner and saluted. The veterans' sons had arranged stops at 5 different veterans' homes across the state, where they would serve meals and listen to stories from those who had served. The rumble of motorcycles now brought smiles instead of fear to people's faces. The veterans' sons had become known throughout the region for their work with military families, their support of deployed soldiers, and their dedication to preserving veterans' stories. As they rode out of town, Harold looked back at Pete's Diner, where it had all began. The morning sun caught his bronze star, now proudly displayed on his jacket, making it shine. In that moment, he knew that his story, and the stories of all those he had served with, would live on through these transformed young men who had finally found their true purpose. The legacy of respect, honor, and service that had begun in one small diner would continue to grow, touching lives and changing hearts, proving that it's never too late for redemption, and that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is give others the chance to change. 3 months after the confrontation at Pete's Diner, the town of Miller's Creek had changed in ways nobody could have predicted. The former Black Vipers, now known as the Veterans' Sons, had transformed from a group of troublemakers into respected members of the community. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning, the rumble of motorcycles could be heard pulling into Pete's diner, but now it was a welcome sound. Max and his friends would join Harold for breakfast, listening intently as he shared stories about their grandfathers and the true meaning of honor. "Tell us again about the time Grandpa helped save those children in Okinawa," Max would ask, sitting in what was now called the Veterans Corner, a special section of the diner decorated with military photographs and medals that Pete had set up. The veterans' sons had taken their new mission seriously. They started by repainting the local veterans' home, spending their weekends fixing the aging building's roof, and planting a garden where the elderly veterans could sit and enjoy the fresh air. Their motorcycle skills came in handy too. They began offering free rides to veterans who needed to get to medical appointments. "Never thought I'd see the day," Sally said one morning, watching as two of the bikers helped an elderly veteran from the home climb carefully onto a specially modified motorcycle sidecar. "Those boys went from causing trouble to being guardian angels." Harold's influence spread beyond just the bikers. Word got around about what had happened at the diner, and soon veterans from neighboring towns started showing up to share their own stories. The Veterans Corner became a place where old soldiers could find understanding and young people could learn about sacrifice and duty. Max had taken his transformation particularly seriously. He removed his snake tattoo and replaced it with a Marine Corps emblem matching his grandfather's. He spent hours with Harold, learning about his family's military history and understanding the true meaning of the medals and honors his grandfather had earned. "You've given me back my heritage," Max told Harold one quiet morning. "I always knew Grandpa was a hero, but I never really understood what that meant until now." The other bikers had similar stories of redemption. One young man, whose father had died in Vietnam, finally found peace by helping organize a memorial service at the veterans' home. Another discovered that his skill with motorcycles could help disabled veterans experience the freedom of the open road again. Even the diner itself had changed. Pete hung a large American flag in the window, and every morning at sunrise, Harold would lead whoever was present in raising it. The ceremony became a town tradition, with people stopping their cars to watch and pay respect. The regular customers noticed the change too. Tom the mailman no longer rushed through his route, instead taking time to deliver special letters and care packages to the veterans' home, organized by the veterans' sons. Barbara from the flower shop provided fresh flowers every week for the veterans' memorial garden the bikers had planted. One particularly touching moment came when the veterans' sons organized a surprise for Harold. They had spent weeks secretly restoring an old military Jeep identical to the one he had driven during the war. When they unveiled it in front of the diner, Harold's eyes filled with tears. "This isn't just a vehicle," Harold explained to the gathered crowd, his hand running along the restored Jeep's hood. "This is a reminder of all the brave men I served with. And now," he looked at the transformed bikers standing proudly nearby, "it's a symbol of how the past can heal the present." The local newspaper ran a story about the transformation, featuring a photo of Harold sitting in his usual booth, surrounded by the veterans' sons. The headline read, "From Trouble to Tribute: How One Veteran Changed a Town's Heart." But perhaps the most significant change was in the way the town's young people now treated their elders. The respect shown by the former troublemakers had sparked a wider movement. High school students began volunteering at the veterans' home, recording the stories of those who had served, ensuring their memories would live on. "You see," Harold told Max one morning, watching a group of teenagers helping an old veteran tend the memorial garden, "sometimes it takes a wrong turn to find the right path." Max nodded, understanding now what his grandfather had always tried to teach him about honor, respect, and the true meaning of strength. The veterans' sons had found their true calling, not in causing fear, but in preserving the legacy of heroes like Harold and their own grandfathers. The morning sun finally broke through the clouds, sending streaks of light through Pete's diner's windows as Harold faced the group of bikers. Max stood trembling, tears still running down his face, looking nothing like the tough gang leader he'd been just minutes before. "Your grandfather," Harold said softly, "Jimmy Jr., he grew up to be one of the finest men I ever knew. He joined the Marines because he wanted to honor his father's sacrifice. And now here you are, his grandson, wearing that leather jacket, trying to be tough." He shook his head sadly. "But you're tough in all the wrong ways, son." Max suddenly dropped to his knees beside Harold's table. I had no idea," he choked out. Grandpa used to tell stories about a brave sergeant who saved everyone. He said that man taught him what real courage was. He looked up at Harold, his tough guy mask completely gone. That was you. All this time, we've been disrespecting a man my grandfather revered. The other bikers stood up one by one, removing their caps and leather jackets. Under those jackets, several of them wore military-related t-shirts, some with Marine Corps logos, others with Army insignias. Most of us, one of the younger bikers spoke up. We're veterans' kids or grandkids. We formed this gang thinking we were honoring their memory somehow, being tough like they were. His voice cracked with shame, but we've dishonored everything they stood for. Harold placed a gentle hand on Max's shoulder. Your grandfather once told me something important. He said that the toughest thing he ever did wasn't fighting in battles. It was coming home and choosing to be kind in a world that had shown him so much cruelty. Sally brought over fresh coffee for everyone, her hands steady now as she witnessed the transformation happening in her diner. Pete emerged from behind the counter, carrying an old photo album he kept in his office. Mr. Thompson, Pete said, opening the album, I've been saving these photos for years. He pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping showing a younger Harold standing with a group of Marines, including a man who looked remarkably like Max. That's Grandpa, Max exclaimed, touching the photo gently. And you? You were there with him all along. Harold nodded. Every Veterans Day, every Memorial Day, your grandfather and I would meet right here in this diner. We'd remember those we lost and celebrate those who made it home. His eyes grew distant with memories. He was so proud when you were born, Max. Called me up right away to tell me his grandson had arrived. The transformation in the diner was remarkable. The bikers who had spent weeks terrorizing the place were now sitting quietly, listening to Harold with respect and attention. Some were wiping tears from their eyes, others looked ashamed of their previous behavior. One by one, they began sharing their own stories. One biker's father had served in Vietnam. Another's sister was currently deployed in Afghanistan. They had all been searching for ways to connect with their family's military legacy, but had lost their way. From now on, Max declared, standing up straight, the Black Vipers are done. We're changing our name to the Veterans' Sons. He looked at his fellow bikers. And we're changing our mission. Instead of causing trouble, we're going to help veterans in need. The other bikers nodded in agreement, their faces showing determination and purpose. There's a veterans' home on the edge of town, Harold suggested. They could always use volunteers. And some of those old soldiers, they just need someone to talk to, someone to listen to their stories. We'll be there, sir, Max said firmly. Every week, and, he paused, looking embarrassed, would you consider being our advisor? Help us understand what our grandfathers went through. Teach us how to honor their memory the right way. Harold's eyes filled with tears, but his smile was bright. I'd be honored, he said. But first, you boys need to help Sally clean up all the coffee you've spilled over the past few weeks. The bikers laughed, not the harsh, mocking laughter of before, but genuine, warm laughter. They immediately got up, asking Sally for mops and rags, eager to begin making things right. Pete's diner, which had been a place of tension and fear, was transforming into something new. A place where the past and present could meet, where lessons could be learned, and where even the toughest hearts could be changed by the power of understanding and respect. The diner remained frozen in silence as Harold reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out one final item, a worn yellow piece of paper. His hands, usually shaking with age, were perfectly steady as he unfolded it. This, he said, his voice filling the quiet diner, is a letter from President Truman himself. Would you boys like to know what it says? He didn't wait for an answer from the stunned bikers. For exceptional bravery and leadership under heavy enemy fire, Harold Reed, Sergeant Harold James Thompson distinguished himself by saving not only his entire platoon, but also a group of civilian children during the Battle of Okinawa. Max, the snake-tattooed leader, slowly sank into the nearest chair. The tough appearance he had worked so hard to maintain was crumbling with each word Harold spoke. But that's not why I'm showing you this, Harold continued, carefully refolding the letter. I'm showing you because every single one of those men I served with taught me something important. Something you boys seem to have forgotten. He turned to face the entire group of bikers, his blue eyes sharp and clear. Strength isn't about intimidation. It's not about making others feel small. Real strength? Real strength is about protecting those who need protection, standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. Sally had stopped pretending to wipe tables and was openly crying now. Pete stood behind his counter, his chest swelling with pride for his old friend. The regular customers watched in amazement as the feared black vipers sat in uncomfortable silence. You boys ride around on those motorcycles, wearing tough-looking jackets, trying to scare people, Harold said, his voice growing stronger. But let me tell you something, I've seen real tough men. They were the ones who shared their last water with a frightened child in Okinawa. They were the ones who carried their wounded friends through miles of jungle, never leaving anyone behind. Harold picked up his bronze star from the table. This medal, it's not just a piece of metal. It represents a promise we made to protect, to serve, to show respect to all. Even after the war, that promise didn't end. Then Harold did something unexpected. He smiled. It was a gentle smile, the kind that reminded everyone of their own grandfathers. I've watched you boys for weeks now. You're not bad men. You're lost men, looking for respect in all the wrong places. He turned to Max directly. You got a military tattoo on your arm. Marine Corps. Your father or grandfather serve? Max's tough facade completely disappeared. My grandfather, he stammered. He was in the Pacific too. Never talked much about it, but he had a medal like yours. He passed away last year. What was his name? Harold asked quietly. James Connor Jr., Max replied, his voice barely a whisper. Named after his father. The color drained from Harold's face. He looked again at the photo he had shown earlier, the one of the young Marine who had died in his arms. Jimmy Connor, he said softly. Your grandfather was Jimmy's son. The diner seemed to hold its collective breath. Max nodded slowly, realization dawning on his face. I promised your great-grandfather as he lay dying that I would make sure his son knew what a hero his father was, Harold said, his voice thick with emotion. I kept that promise, visited them after the war, watched little Jimmy Jr. grow up. He never knew I was the one who held his father's hand at the end. Max stood up suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Tears were streaming down his face, destroying his tough guy image completely. You're that Sergeant Thompson. The one Grandpa always talked about. The hero who saved his father's whole platoon. Harold stood straight and proud, every bit the sergeant he had been all those years ago. I am, and I have something to say to all of you boys, something that might change your lives, just like the war changed mine. The bikers leaned forward, hanging on every word. The next few sentences Harold spoke would transform not just their lives, but the entire town's understanding of what true strength really meant. The next morning dawned gray and cloudy, matching the tense atmosphere at Pete's diner. Harold arrived earlier than usual, his steps measured and purposeful. The regular customers noticed something different about him today. He wasn't wearing his usual sweater, but instead had on a pressed blue shirt with military pins carefully attached to the collar. The black vipers were already there, sprawled across their usual spots. Max was holding Harold's wedding photograph, which he had kept from yesterday, making it into a paper airplane. Look who's here, boys! Max called out, his voice mocking. The old-timers dressed up special for us today. Harold walked straight to his regular booth, not using his cane. His back was straighter than anyone had seen in years. Sally watched from behind the counter, holding her breath. She had never seen such a determined look in the old veteran's eyes. Move, Harold said quietly to the two bikers sitting in his booth. His voice, though soft, carried a strength that made several customers turn their heads. The bikers looked at each other and laughed. Did you hear something, boys? Max asked, walking over. Sounds like a mouse squeaking. He deliberately knocked over a full cup of coffee, sending the hot liquid streaming toward Harold's shoes. The diner fell completely silent. Even the sizzling of bacon in the kitchen seemed to quiet down. Pete stood frozen behind the counter, his hand on the phone. Tom the mailman had stopped mid-bite, his toast forgotten. Everyone waited to see what would happen next. Harold didn't move as the coffee pulled around his well-polished shoes. Instead, he reached slowly into his pocket and pulled out something that made the entire diner gasp, a small, worn leather box. You boys seem to find great joy in tormenting an old man, Harold said, his voice growing stronger with each word. Let me show you something. With steady hands, he opened the box, Inside lay a Bronze Star medal, its surface still gleaming after all these years. Next to it was a faded photograph showing young soldiers standing in front of a burning tank. "That's me," Harold said, pointing to a tall, strong young man in the center of the photo. "And that tank behind us, that's the German panzer I took out to save my entire platoon. 37 men lived because one farm boy from Nebraska refused to run away." Max's face had lost its smirk. The other bikers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "This coffee you spilled," Harold continued, his voice steady and clear, "reminds me of the mud in the Pacific. We lived in it for weeks, watching our friends die, fighting for the very freedom that allows you to sit here and disrespect an old man." He took out another photo from the box, a group of young Marines, dirty and tired but smiling. "Third row, second from the left, that's Jimmy Connor. Died in my arms during the Battle of Okinawa. His last words were asking me to tell his mama he wasn't scared." The biker with the snake tattoo had gone pale. The wedding photo of Martha slipped from his fingers onto the table. "And that woman you've been mocking?" Harold picked up Martha's photo gently. "She waited 3 years for me to come home. Wrote me every single day. When I lost my hearing in my left ear from a grenade blast, she learned sign language even though I told her it wasn't necessary. She spent 57 years by my side, making me a better man every day." Harold's voice broke slightly at the mention of Martha, but his eyes remained fierce and proud. "I faced tanks, bullets, and watched good men die. I've held my wife's hand as cancer took her away. And you think a bunch of boys on motorcycles are going to frighten me?" The silence in the diner was absolute. Even the morning traffic outside seemed to have gone quiet. Sally had tears running down her face. Pete stood straight and proud behind his counter, looking at Harold with newfound respect. Max opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The tough biker who had terrorized the diner for weeks looked like a schoolboy who had just been caught misbehaving. Harold wasn't finished. He had one more thing to say, and it would change everything. Over the next 3 weeks, the situation at Pete's Diner grew worse with each passing day. The bikers, who called themselves the Black Vipers, made it their mission to torment Harold every morning. They seemed to take special pleasure in watching the old veteran struggle to maintain his dignity while they found new ways to make his life difficult. One particularly harsh morning, Harold arrived to find his regular booth occupied by 2 of the bikers, who sprawled across the seats with their muddy boots up on the table. Sally, who had been watching anxiously through the kitchen window, rushed out to help. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson," she whispered. "Maybe you'd like to sit at the counter today." But before Harold could answer, the snake-tattooed leader, who they now knew was called Max, shouted from across the diner. "Yeah, old-timer, the counter's perfect for you. Right next to the coffee maker, you won't have to walk so far with those shaky legs." The other bikers roared with laughter, causing several customers to leave their breakfast half-eaten. Pete's Diner, once filled with friendly chatter and the clinking of coffee cups, had become a place of tension and whispered conversations. Harold settled himself at the counter, his movements slow but deliberate. His blue coffee mug, now bearing several new chips from the bikers' accidents, was placed before him by Sally's trembling hands. She had tried standing up to them once, only to have them threaten to make trouble for the diner. "Look what I found outside," one of the younger bikers announced, walking in with Harold's cane. He had clearly taken it from where Harold had parked his car. "Fancy stick like this shouldn't be left alone. Someone might break it." He ran his fingers along the smooth wood threateningly. Harold's face remained calm, but his knuckles turned white as he gripped the counter edge. That cane had been a gift from Martha on their 50th anniversary, hand-carved with their initials near the handle. "Return Mr. Thompson's cane," Pete said firmly from behind the counter, his patience finally wearing thin, "or I'm calling the police." The biker laughed and tossed the cane roughly across the diner. It clattered against a table before falling to the floor, leaving a small scratch in the wood. Harold said nothing, but his eyes followed his precious cane's path. The harassment continued as the bikers found new ways to torment him. They would bump his elbow while he was drinking coffee, causing it to spill. They mixed salt into his sugar dispenser and turned his newspaper into paper airplanes. Each day, they seemed to grow bolder. Regular customers tried to help in small ways. Tom the mailman started arriving earlier to sit near Harold. Barbara from the flower shop would bring fresh flowers for his table, trying to brighten his mornings. But the bikers just mocked their efforts, calling them the old-timers' bodyguards. The final straw came when Harold pulled out his worn leather wallet to pay for his breakfast, as he had done thousands of times before. Inside was the precious photo of him and Martha on their wedding day, the one thing that always brought a smile to his face, no matter how bad things got. Max, walking past, snatched the wallet from Harold's hands. "What we got here?" he sneered, pulling out the photograph. Well, who's the pretty lady? Your nurse." Harold's face turned pale. For the first time since the bikers had started their harassment, real fear showed in his eyes. That photograph was his most treasured possession. "Please," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. "That's private." The other bikers gathered around, passing the photo between them with greasy fingers, making crude jokes about Martha's appearance. Harold stood up from his counter seat, his legs shaking not from age but from anger. Sally covered her mouth in horror, watching the scene unfold. Pete reached for the phone, ready to call the police, but stopped when he saw the look in Harold's eyes. Something had changed. The quiet, patient man who had endured weeks of torment was gone. In his place stood someone else, someone who had faced much worse than a gang of disrespectful bikers. Tomorrow would be different. Harold knew it was time to show these young men exactly who they had been bullying. As he walked out of the diner that morning, leaving his precious photo still in their hands, his mind was already made up. The next day would change everything. The peaceful atmosphere at Pete's Diner changed dramatically one spring morning when the rumble of motorcycle engines shook the windows. 6 large motorcycles pulled into the parking lot, their chrome parts gleaming in the sunlight. The riders, dressed in black leather jackets covered with patches, walked into the diner with heavy boots that thundered against the tile floor. Harold looked up from his coffee, his weathered hands tightening slightly around his blue mug. The bikers were loud and rough-looking, with long beards and tattoos covering their arms. They chose the booth next to Harold's regular spot, even though there were plenty of empty tables in the diner. "Hey, Grandpa," one of the bikers called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "Better hold on to that coffee tight. Wouldn't want those shaky hands to spill it." His friends laughed, the sound harsh and unwelcome in the usually peaceful diner. Sally approached their table, her usual cheerful smile replaced with a nervous expression. "What can I get for you gentlemen today?" she asked, her pen hovering over her notepad. "Coffee, black, and make it quick," the largest biker demanded. He had a snake tattoo on his neck and seemed to be their leader. "And some of those pancakes we smell, all of us." He didn't say please or thank you, and his tone made Sally hurry away quickly. Harold tried to focus on his breakfast, but the bikers' loud conversation and occasional bursts of laughter made it difficult. They kept glancing his way and snickering, especially when he reached for his cane. "Look at that fancy stick he's got," one of them said loudly. "Bet it cost more than my first bike." More laughter followed. Pete watched the situation from behind the counter, his face showing concern. Other regular customers began to leave early, throwing sympathetic looks at Harold as they hurried past the biker's table. Tom the mailman hesitated by Harold's booth, wanting to help but unsure what to do. "I'm fine, Tom," Harold said quietly. "Best get on with your route." His voice was steady, but his eyes showed his discomfort. When Sally brought the bikers their food, they started making even more noise, deliberately dropping their forks and demanding refills every few minutes. One of them reached over and grabbed Harold's newspaper without asking. "Hope you were done with this, Pops," he said with a smirk, not waiting for an answer before spreading it open and tearing several pages in the process. The other regulars in the diner watched helplessly as the bikers continued their subtle bullying. Barbara from the flower shop tried to speak up, but her voice was drowned out by their loud laughter. Harold finished his coffee more quickly than usual that morning. As he stood up carefully, using his cane for support, one of the bikers stuck out his foot, nearly tripping him. Harold managed to catch himself, but his cane clattered to the floor. "Oops," the biker said, pretending to be innocent. "Did I do that?" Sally rushed over to help, but Harold waved her away gently. "I can manage," he said, his voice dignified despite the situation. It took him a moment, but he retrieved his cane without falling. As Harold made his way to the counter to pay his bill, he could hear the bikers mimicking his slow walk and making jokes about retirement homes and ancient relics. "It's on the house today, Mr. Thompson," Pete said quietly, but Harold insisted on paying as usual. Same time tomorrow? Sally asked, trying to sound normal. The worry showed in her eyes. Same time tomorrow, Harold confirmed, his voice firm despite the morning's events. He might be old, but he wasn't going to let anyone chase him away from his favorite place. As Harold walked slowly toward the door, he heard one of the bikers say, "See you tomorrow, old-timer. We really like this place." The threat in his voice was clear. They would be back. Outside in the parking lot, Harold paused to catch his breath. The spring air felt cooler than usual, and the familiar comfort of his morning routine had been shattered. But as he looked back at Pete's diner, a determination settled in his eyes. He had faced worse things in his life than a group of disrespectful bikers. Tomorrow would be another day, and Harold Thompson had never been one to back down from a challenge. The morning sun peeked through the large windows of Pete's diner, casting a warm golden glow across the worn leather seats and chrome-trimmed tables. Harold Thompson, a 93-year-old veteran with wisps of white hair and kind blue eyes, carefully pushed open the glass door with his wooden cane. The small bell above the door chimed softly, announcing his arrival just as it had done every morning for the past 30 years. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," called out Sally, the middle-aged waitress who had been serving him for over 15 years. Her bright smile and cheerful voice were as much a part of his morning routine as his cup of black coffee. "Your usual spot is waiting for you." Harold moved slowly but steadily toward his favorite corner booth. His movements were deliberate, each step carefully planned, but his eyes remained sharp and alert. The familiar smell of fresh coffee and bacon filled the air, bringing back memories of countless mornings spent in this very spot with his late wife, Martha. "Thank you, Sally," he said, carefully lowering himself onto the red leather seat that had molded to his shape over the years. His cane found its usual resting place against the wall, within easy reach but out of the way. "Looks like another beautiful day in Nebraska." The diner was quiet at this early hour, just the way Harold liked it. A few regular customers nodded in his direction: Tom the mailman, Barbara from the flower shop, and old Joe who ran the hardware store. They all knew better than to disturb Harold's morning ritual, but their presence was a comfortable reminder that some things in life stayed wonderfully consistent. Sally didn't even need to take his order. Within minutes, she returned with a steaming cup of black coffee in his favorite blue mug, the one with a small chip on the handle that he'd been using for so many years that the owner, Pete, had unofficially declared it Harold's mug. "Here you go, Mr. Thompson, and I got your wheat toast coming right up." Sally placed the coffee carefully on the table, making sure it was within easy reach. She knew his hands weren't as steady as they used to be, but Harold insisted on managing on his own. As he sat there, Harold's mind wandered to the old days. Through the large window beside his booth, he watched the small town of Miller's Creek coming to life. The sight reminded him of returning home after the war, when everything seemed possible and the whole world lay ahead of him. He had met Martha right here in this diner, back when it was called Johnson's Place and had different owners. Harold reached into his worn leather wallet and pulled out a small, faded photograph. It showed a much younger version of himself in his military uniform, standing proud and tall beside Martha on their wedding day. Her smile still made his heart skip a beat, even after all these years. 3 years had passed since she left him, but sometimes it felt like yesterday. "Your toast, Mr. Thompson," Sally said softly, noticing him lost in thought. She placed the plate in front of him, the wheat toast perfectly browned and cut diagonally, just the way he liked it. "And I added a little extra butter today. You're looking a bit thin." Harold smiled at her motherly concern. "Thank you, Sally. Martha would have approved of you looking after me like this." The morning continued its peaceful pace. Harold enjoyed his simple breakfast while watching people hurry past the diner's window. Young mothers pushing strollers, businessmen clutching briefcases, and school children with backpacks almost too big for them, all part of the daily parade of life that he had observed for so many years. Pete, the diner's owner, emerged from the kitchen and gave Harold a friendly wave. "Beautiful morning, isn't it, Harold? How's that coffee treating you?" "Just perfect, Pete. Just perfect." Harold took another sip from his chipped blue mug, savoring the rich flavor. This was his sanctuary, his piece of the world where everything made sense. Here, he wasn't just another elderly man with a cane. He was Harold Thompson, respected regular, friend, and keeper of countless memories. Little did Harold know that this peaceful morning routine, as familiar as the beating of his own heart, was about to face an unexpected challenge. But for now, he sat contentedly in his corner booth, watching the world go by, one sip of coffee at a time.